Welcome to today's lunch hour lecture. My name is Professor Bob Shiel. I'm from the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. A little bit of housekeeping first. Could you all just make sure your phones are on silent so we don't want any disruption to the recording? Thanks. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker very, very briefly. The subject, as you all know already, is about cinema in the 1960s, and it's part of an ongoing AHRC-funded project entitled Cultural Memory and British Cinema Going of the 1960s. Our speaker today, I think, must be one of the most fast-track speakers in the lunch hour lecture series. He only arrived in UCL in January of this year, so I think that's pretty impressive to be already on the lunch hour lecture series in such a short space of time. Matthews comes to us from Manchester, where I've been reading a little bit about his work prior to today's talk, and he's explored ideas of gender response in audiences according to cinema, and also I think what's fascinating is a particularly British response to science fiction film of the 1950s. So could I ask you to please give a warm welcome to Dr. Matthew Jones.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic working? No? Okay, our mic's not working. Minor technical hitch. Cheers. Hello? No? Okay, still nothing. I'll work with this. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for coming down today. It's really appreciated. It's cold outside, I know, so thank you. And thanks also for everyone who is watching online as well, either today or at a later date. That's a really useful thing to have. So today's talk is about remembering 1960s cinema going, and as we say, it's part of a broader project that we're working on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing on the project, a little bit about where we're up to with the project so far, and a little bit about where we're going from there, and kind of some preliminary findings, things that we're starting to find emerging from the data as well. But I'm going to start by asking you this question. How do we remember the 1960s? When we think of the 1960s, this seems to be going by itself. Okay, when we think of the 1960s, what is it that we remember? And as part of that, I'm going to show you a brief clip from a documentary by UK TV History. And the documentary series is called The 60s, The Beatles Decade. I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes of this. And while you're watching it, have a think about what is this telling us about the 1960s? What is this preserving of the 1960s in memory?
This is the story of the Beatles and the decade that brought them to fame. In 1960, Britain was ruled by a conservative government, and American pop music dominated youth culture. At the end of the 60s, there was a grammar school boy at number 10, and British culture had gone global. The pill brought sex without fear of pregnancy. Homosexuality became legal, and censorship ended in the theatre.
Oh, 60s were responsible for some of the greatest movements in the arts, in dance, in mime, in music, in drama.
The consumer society boomed. Half of Britain became homeowners, and more people took holidays abroad.
Suddenly, with the Beatles, we weren't necessarily going to be our dads.
The Beatles were at the heart of this transformation.
I want to hold your hand. I heard it, and my life was changed.
This series is about the cultural and social revolution that was the 60s. The Beatles became a symbol for the decade. 4 lads from Liverpool who took on the establishment and won. The world would never be the same.
This documentary series, which is preserving a particular memory of the 1960s. It's a particular image of the 60s. It's not all of the 60s. It's particular aspects of the 60s that's being preserved in memory here. So we've got a focus on youth culture, on music, on pop culture. And these are the sorts of ideas that come back in all sorts of different ways when we... Sorry, apparently the mic isn't working. I'll roll from this, apologies. Apparently these are different ideas that come back in different ways when we look at the 60s. So in order to demonstrate this, I did a very rough and ready piece of research for you, which was a quick Google image search for Britain in the 1960s. And these are the sorts of images that come up. So again, we get this focus on music, on the Beatles in particular. The Rolling Stones, of course, as well. We get fashion. We get, by the way, in fashion, the one in the bottom left is a particular favourite of mine. We get hairstyles. We get this notion of mods and rockers. The sexual revolution is playing out there, particularly in the protest on the kind of second row up on the right-hand side, and also political changes as well. So there's this notion of revolution going on in the 60s, both in a cultural and a political sense. And also tied into that, youth culture, fashion, music. And what I'd argue is that we could perhaps add film to that as well, because cinema played a key role in creating this construction of the 1960s that we now remember. So let me show you this. In 1967, we get Time magazine naming London the swinging city. Swinging London is born. And this image is the cover of that magazine, the cover of Time magazine. And we can see here that those same images of the 60s are being reproduced. The things that we now remember of the 60s are being reproduced in this image here. So what was focused on in 1967? Well, The Who on the T-shirt down in the front. So again, music coming out to play. Fashion as well. The lady in the kind of bottom left of that image is fantastic. I love her glasses. Are those her glasses? Are those her eyes? This kind of sense of vibrancy, of colour, of youth. So there's a particular image at play in 67 in the swinging London phenomenon in this Time magazine cover and all that came after, that now we're kind of harking back to, that when we remember the 60s, we're drawing on. And this isn't just going on in Time magazine, this is happening all over the place, particularly in film. And so we get a series of movies that are now called the Swinging London movies. They're known as the Swinging London movies. And they are often about young people living vibrant, sexy lives in the capital, in London. And we get Darling from 1965, starring the incomparable Julie Christie. We get Blow Up from 66, directed by Antonioni. Alfie from 66, Michael Caine. I mean, these are quite risque movies. This is one that touches on abortion as well, which is only decriminalised in 67. So these are movies that, yes, they present this kind of glamorous, swinging London life, but also there's a darker side to them as well. But often in memory, that's more or less glossed over. Georgia Girl in 66, and you can see Tower Bridge in the background there, so clearly locating this as a London movie at the height of swinging London. And Bedazzled in 67, which, I mean, that image really says it all. I'm not sure I need to say much more than that. It's a sexy, fun, glamorous movie about young people, about the capital. So all of these ideas about youth culture, about London, about vibrancy, all being tied together by the imagery associated with the swinging London phenomenon, and also with cinema, and now being preserved in memory more than perhaps other images of the 1960s. You can see here again the miniskirt, which becomes kind of a key icon of the 60s. Sold by Mary Quant in Bazaar, her boutique on Carnaby Street in 1964. It starts to be sold there. 1965, 1 year later, Julie Christie, here on the right-hand side, wins an Oscar for Darling, and look what she's wearing. So there's no accidents here. This is a kind of a deliberate play into youth culture in Darling here, into this mood of the 60s, the zeitgeist of the time. And so cinema plays a really key role in continually reproducing this image of the 60s throughout the 60s, and because these films survive up to the present day as well. But of course, this isn't an entirely accurate image of the 1960s, and we're now starting to question whether this is what the 60s was actually all about. Historians such as Dominic Sandbrook are starting to say, how much of this revolution actually, how much was Britain changed by this cultural revolution? How quickly was it changed? How radically was it changed? So we're starting to ask questions around this narrative of the 60s as an era of vibrancy, of change in British culture. And in cinema, too, we get this coming through. So the British New Wave is a wave of cinema, a series of films that starts in the late 50s but carries on into the early to mid-60s. And these are gritty movies. They're often set in the North, social problem films, often focusing on working class families. They're shot in black and white. So there's kind of an austere atmosphere around these films. And so here we have Saturday Night, Sunday Morning from 1960, which is in the bottom left. Taste of Honey from 1961 in the top right. Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner from 1962 in the top left. a kind of Loving also from 1962 in the bottom right, and then right in the middle, The Sporting Life from 1963. So this is kind of the British New Wave, this other image of Britain that's coming through in British cinema in the 1960s. Yes, it's slightly earlier than the Swinging London movies, but when we look back on 60s cinema, I find it particularly interesting that we tend to remember this kind of glamorous, youthful existence over perhaps the other types of stories that are being told about Britain in the 60s. And I think that Google search and the documentary from earlier demonstrate that quite well. And this isn't just something that's happening in cinema. I mean, Britain isn't just swinging in the 1960s. There's other things going on as well. I mean, some economic data for you, which is always fun, I know. Trade with the Commonwealth drops by 50% over the decade. And London alone loses 360,000 manufacturing jobs. And between 1960 and 1973, GDP growth is, and I don't want to give you the wrong number, 2.9%, which today looks like a paradise. That's utopian growth. But at the time, it was quite significantly behind much of Western Europe and America. And so Britain was seen to be losing out in terms of productivity, in terms of its competitiveness. Economically, Britain wasn't doing perhaps as well as sometimes we think it did during the 60s. And so it's perhaps no surprise that the British New Wave comes along, but what is surprising is that reality, that image of Britain, isn't as frequently recalled now as the Swinging London phenomenon. When we talk about kind of cultural memories of the 60s, it's very much the Beatles, fashion, the miniskirt that comes through. So we can ask a series of questions around this, and the research that I'm working on at the moment currently is asking these questions. We can say if we've got these two competing images of Britain in the 60s here, top left and bottom right, of course, are these kind of gritty images. The bottom right is from Linus, Long Distance Runner, and top right, of course, we've got The Wonderful Twiggy, and in the bottom left, the Beatles movie Hard Day's Night. So we've got these two contrasting images of Britain in the 60s. We can ask, well, what's happening in terms of cultural memory that one seems to be being privileged above the other? Perhaps more importantly for me, what happens when people remember the 60s? What happens when people remember their own individual experience of the 60s? How do those memories play into these broader cultural memories of the 60s, these shared collective memories of the 60s that we have as a society? What's the relationship between individual memory, collective memory, and crucially cinema sat in the midst of all of this, producing images, yeah? And so those are some of the questions that we're grappling with on the project that I'm currently working on, which is the Cultural Memory and British Cinema Going the 1960s project. And this is a collaboration between myself and Dr. Melvin Stokes, who is sat just there having his lunch. Sorry, Melvin. And the two of us are working together on this AHRC-funded project. And what we're doing is collecting, analysing, and archiving memories of 1960s cinema going in Britain. So we're using questionnaires and oral history techniques to record memories from the era, memories of cinema going, and memories of the way that cinema fit into people's everyday lives. And I think this is particularly important to be done now because within the next few decades, the 60s is going to fall out of living memory. I know that's quite offensive. I saw a woman with an open mouth. Probably not next few decades, probably a few decades after that. But at some point, let's be kind about it. Digging a hole for myself here. At some point, the 60s is going to fall out of living memory, and that's going to be a real shame if we don't have archive of memories, because we can't then go back to those memories as social, as cultural historians. We can't go back and look at what the 60s meant to people in memory. So for me, it's wonderful that the AHRC has allowed us to do this project now. What we're having is fantastic reception from the public so far. We've had 600 respondents, or thereabouts, in the first 8 months that the questionnaire has been online. And there are still roughly 25 months left to go. So we're looking at quite a healthy response. I mean, these numbers aren't going to keep up at that level. Obviously, this will slow down as the project goes into its final 2 years. But, I mean, we're still looking at really healthy response numbers here. And what that allows us to do is to take a look across the decade at a broad kind of cross-section of memories. And partially what I'm going to do today is encourage anyone who has friends, family, or personal memories of the 60s to get involved with the project, to get in touch, to contribute to this. But more on that later. So some of the questions that we're asking, well, what were people watching? These are kind of preliminary findings, so take everything I say today with just a tiny pinch of salt, because, as I say, we're at the end of our first year on the project. There are 2 more years left to come, so there are 2 more years' worth of memories to be collected. So what I'm talking about today is the memories that we've collected so far and what they seem to be telling us. but I reserve the right to go back on everything that I say today at a later date if the data changes. So what are people watching in the 60s? Well, the assumption is they're watching contemporary US and UK cinema because this dominates at the box office. We can go out and find quantitative data about this. We can look at box office statistics and say, what were people watching? What did most people go and see? And it seems to be from that data that UK and US films of the 1960s were dominating the British box office. However, something interesting happens when you look at this in memory. We get memories of pre-1960s films that sit prominently in the memories. This isn't kind of one or two people recalling watching pre-1960s films in the 60s. This is a really kind of prominent feature of the memories. So in memory, watching cinema in the 60s isn't necessarily watching 60s cinema. And that does something to our understanding of the relationship between cinema and broader society in the period. We also find that there are strong memories of newsreels and of local advertising and of cartoons. So cinemas, not just as cinema, cinemas as a space where other things were happening. You could go and watch other things. We have people involved in the project so far who were going to the cinema specifically to watch newsreels, who made a special trip to watch the newsreels. So the cinema wasn't predominantly for them a site of films. It was a site of other activities, other things going on. We're also finding many memories of European films. So this dominance of the US and the UK at the box office, well, yes, they may have dominated the box office, but memory seems to have a special place for European films. Now, of course, there are some caveats to this. We're finding that there were particular towns where there were cinemas that showed European films, and so access to these films is a particular issue here. And so you could only really remember watching European films if you were in a place where they were being shown. So there's geographic difference at play here as well. But what we are finding is really quite strong memories of European, particularly French films, and particularly Jules and Jim, from the 1960s, which challenges our understanding of both Britain's relationship to Europe in the era, but crucially kind of what was happening in British cinemas, what were people experiencing there. And so for me, that's quite interesting. We're also finding memories of cinemas as concert venues, which is something I really hadn't expected. Ticket here from the Beatles playing at the Manchester Odeon, and we've got memories of that concert in the project so far. We have, I believe it's a lady who went to that concert and remembers it for us. We also have memories of the Beatles playing at cinemas in Bedford as well. So cinemas is a space where not just audio-visual entertainment happens, but other types of entertainment too. So it's not just that people aren't going for films, they're going for newsreels, but they're also not even going for the cinema screen at all. They're going for all sorts of other things. So there seems to be kind of a prominence place. Also, sorry, as well, there were kind of concert films happening at the time as well, screenings of concert films. It's an area I want to dig into more. I don't want to say too much about that because I need to kind of figure that out in detail, what these people were watching, whether it was kind of live, whether it was recorded, what was going on there. But it's interesting at least that music and these broader frames of culture are playing into cinema in a way that we've also seen is happening in memory. So more prominent than particular films, perhaps, in the memories, are particular spaces, particular places, particular incidents, and particular people. So we're getting particular memories of cinemas, particular cinemas that people went to frequently during the 1960s. There's a way of framing this in memory that's to do with space. For example, we have a respondent who remembers a particularly drab cinema atrium. And there was a painter who was hired to decorate it, and he was given, I believe, yellow, green, and blue paint. And he was told to paint stripes on the walls. And the cinema owner came back the next day, apparently, and found that he painted a tropical beach scene on the walls. And so this space, this cinema atrium, became part of the memory of that cinema. Our respondent remembers going to it and being in that tropical island space in the atrium, which is a particular engagement with space, a particular kind of way of thinking about and using space. Place as well, there was a cinema in Fort William, which is up in northwest Scotland where I was recently collecting memories. And I was talking to a lady there who was telling me that there was a cinema there which had a corrugated iron roof. And when it rained, which it does in Fort William, I can tell you, you couldn't hear anything. The sound of the rain on the roof completely blotted out the soundtrack to the film. You couldn't hear the dialogue. So people used to make up their own plots in their head to match the images on screen. And so the place, the building, the act of going to that cinema, being in that particular place, shapes the engagement with what's going on screen. And for me, that's fascinating. Cinema isn't just about the films. We need to kind of account for this in a broader a broader way. Particular incidents, there's a favourite of mine which involves a cinema cat in Yorkshire, where the cat came and kind of prowled around the cinema a lot. And there was one time when a woman who had been watching this cat for some time finally had the moment where the cat came and sat on her lap in the film, and it was the best day ever, and I can completely see why. So there's particular incidents that stick out in memory too, and particular people. There's another memory which I particularly like on the project of someone who was going to the cinema, and regularly there was a woman there who came with a picnic basket, essentially, and sat down and opened the picnic basket and laid out a feast for herself, and then sat and munched her way through the film. But no one minded, because it was just that was what happened in that cinema. If you went, you were to expect the picnic. And so there's particular kind of people that feature in memory, people people that our response often didn't know, but they come up in memory and are tied to cinema in particular ways. So how radical was 60s cinema then? If we're talking about an era of supposed cultural revolution, we can ask how radical was it? And Jeffrey Noel Smith, who's got this new book out about kind of the new waves of 60s cinema, the important kind of part to this quote for me is right at the bottom there. British cinema became the most progressive in Europe. He's discussing kind of homosexuality here and censorship. And the conclusion that he reaches in this paragraph is that British cinema became the most progressive in Europe. So there's an image of British cinema as something progressive. But the question that interests me here is, how radical was 60s cinema going? So not the cinema itself, but kind of the act of going to the cinema and being in the cinema. Was that as radical as we're led to believe that the films of the era were too? Although also I have questions about that. And what we're seeing is really strong memories of Saturday morning children's screenings. And this badge here, I have to thank Michael Mortimer, who gave this photograph to us. This is actually from the 40s. But this is a tradition of children's cinema going, these Saturday morning children's screening clubs. Children going to cinema on Saturday mornings. And that's really prominent in the memories that we have of the 60s at the moment. And what Michael's badge here does is demonstrate that actually this is a tradition that's been going on for decades. So there are two ways of thinking about this. The cinema clubs are often remembered as an anarchic space where children ran riot and had a lovely time, and often there was no adult supervision, supposedly in memory. Whether that's kind of accurate or not, we don't know, but in memory there was no adult supervision at a lot of these screening clubs. And so it seems like a radical, free space, but actually it's a tradition that's gone back a couple of decades. I mean, we don't necessarily know what the cinema clubs were like in the 40s and how they compared to the 60s, but there's certainly a traditional aspect to Saturday morning's children's clubs, which the badge here demonstrates quite nicely. We also get this notion that cinema was a space of sexual revolution. So we've got a lot of memories of people kind of getting up to things that they shouldn't do in the back row of cinemas, which is quite lovely to read that. Actually, that was going on in the 60s. So any notion that the 60s was radical, well, that's played out in terms of people's love lives and love lives and relationship to cinema. Here, a particular favourite, one respondent remembers seeing a film twice because he was double dating at the time. So you've got to go see the film twice. Two people are asking you to go. So this suggests that there may be a certain kind of, radicalism probably isn't the right word, but a certain vibrancy, a certain lack of deference around cinema going in the 60s. But at the same time, we have memories of people meeting and courting future spouses in the cinema. So a lot of people are saying to us, I went on a date with this person to the cinema, and then we married. And that was that for me. And so that's actually quite a traditional idea coming through there, quite a traditional approach to dating and to cinema. Also family bonding, cinema as a space of the family, memories like Mary Poppins and so on. There's a really, and of course Sound of Music as well, so there's a really strong kind of sense of a family around the cinema, of family outings. And so we can ask questions around, well actually how radical was cinema going? How different was cinema going in the 60s to the 50s? And this is something we're still grappling with in the project. We can also ask, did cinema mirror 1960s society at the time? What was 1960s society at the time? What did it mean to people? So we asked this question directly, and of the first 100 respondents, which is what I've been through so far, 47% of those who responded to the question felt that cinema did reflect their lives in the 60s, 53% felt that it did not. And okay, that's fairly even divide there. Probably can't make too many conclusions out of that, other than there was a divided opinion on it. But respondents frequently recognised when they talked about the reality that cinema was reflecting, that it was a reality that they imagined other Britons to lead. So we got people saying things like, the kitchen sink dramas were more real than life, but that actually only one film that they saw of the kitchen sink dramas reflected their life. So there's a break between the reality experience, the reality on screen, and the reality imagined that other people live. We also get this wonderful quote about cinema bringing real life home to people like me who otherwise had not experienced it, as if one's own life is not real life. Real life is happening elsewhere, yeah? And that's mediated via cinema. You see these real British lives on cinema, and they're distinct from one's own. And that's an idea that I find particularly fascinating. So what we can ask here is, does it seem that cinema was becoming more real than the lived experience, real in inverted commas there? So there's some interesting questions being posed there. I wouldn't want to make any conclusions because, as I say, we're still early on in the project. But there are some interesting questions emerging about reality. And this kind of imagined reality is being posed in a number of different ways. It's being located in terms of geography. So people saying, well, I was in London, so I didn't get to experience the reality of the north, of the kitchen sink movies, of the gritty northern dramas. Or people saying, well, I was in the north, so I didn't get to live swinging London. So geography is a key factor in terms of this kind of imagined community of Britain. Age as well, people saying I was too young to experience the swinging 60s, or I was too old to experience the swinging 60s. So this kind of imagined reality of Britain is being located by age. By economics as well. So we have one person in particular saying that the reality of cinema was something or the reality of the Britain seen in cinema was something that was being experienced, but it was being experienced by, and I quote, the other half. So there's a notion of kind of economics coming into play here. Can you afford to live in this real Britain of the cinema screen? And finally, it's been negotiated in terms of class. So one respondent in particular felt that films presented, and I quote, the perspective of literary intellectuals, not always British, on the lower British class. So cinema is seen as an imposition, both actually in terms of class and nationality there. And also on the other side of that, another respondent saying that British films were too working class to represent their own experiences. So all sorts of different perspectives on the relationship between class, reality, British life, and cinema coming through here, which I think is interesting. So in conclusion, what are we seeing here? Well, there's an appeal to cinema going in 1960s Britain. It was clearly popular activity, even though cinemas were closing down. I mean, we lost 50% of cinema screens in Britain over the decade. But it's still a popular and enduring activity. But its appeal is much broader than it seems that we previously thought. It's certainly much broader than simply 1960s British and American films. There's more of interest here to people in cinemas in the 1960s. 1960s cinemas were also spaces for both radical and traditional behaviour. There's, as I said, in the memories, we've got all sorts of different types of behaviour coming through in cinemas, all sorts of different ways of engaging with cinema going. And they're not all kind of countercultural, they're not all youthful, they're not all swinging London, if you will, but they're also not all traditional. So cinema seems to be quite a complex space in terms of social behaviour. And finally, 1960s cinema is enabling the construction of these complex, contradictory fantasies about the nation, about the decade, and about British lifestyles. And that's true both in the time when this kind of fantasy Britain was being constructed via the cinema screen, but also now. I mean, 1960s cinema, as I said, is playing a key role in constructing memories of the 60s, cultural memories, broad kind of social collective memories of the 60s. And so this kind of fantasy of Britain is being perpetuated now, although perhaps in slightly different ways. Finally, just if you'll indulge me, how can you get involved in the project? Well, we're running a series of events. Details of these are on the website. The address is at the bottom there, ucl.ac.uk/cinema memories. And if you want to find out about the events, then pop/events on the end. There's more coming soon, but Norwich, Bristol, Nottingham, London at the BFI, Manchester and Cambridge are all upcoming. So have a look at what those events are about. Often they're kind of film screenings and discussions. Sometimes with invited speakers as well. We've got Dr. Charlotte Crofts coming to Bristol, which will be fantastic. She's done a lot of work around cinema, memory, and place. And finally, you can complete a questionnaire, or if you have a relative or a colleague or a friend who has memories of the 60s, then complete a questionnaire. These are available online. You can download it and print it and then post it back to us, or you can complete it online. We have an online platform where you can do the questionnaire. Or you can request a paper copy of the questionnaire from us at that telephone number, or our email address, which is cinemamemories@ucl.ac.uk, or by writing to us at the free post address on the screen. So please do get involved. It's a project that we really can't do without our contributors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. We have a few minutes for some questions now. Do we have any questions from the audience? Got one here straight away. Just give me a moment.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Did you get any respondents that were cinema owners so far? And what did they have to say? Not necessarily about their own personal experience. Did they have anything to say about what they observed of experiences around them?
I'm going to need the microphone back because of the recording. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, well, actually, cinema owners, I don't think we have anyone yet. We certainly have projectionists, and a couple of them at least. We also have ushers and usherettes as well, which is great, and actually it's a unique perspective on cinema going. As for what they're saying, I wouldn't want to say too much because it's not something that I've had time to delve into in detail yet. It's something that we're interested in and something that the project's going to get to grips with. But at present, we haven't looked at kind of how that differs specifically. But yes, we do have those memories in there, and they do appear to be more reflective, perhaps more focused on audience than on film, which I find quite interesting. But again, this is kind of very early stuff, and I wouldn't want to speak to that in too much detail, but come back and see us in a year or 2 years, and I'm sure we'll have more on that then once we've had a chance to get into what those memories are telling us.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. Some things that I remember quite clearly that you hadn't mentioned, one was that there always seemed to be an organ playing. The other was when I went to Liverpool and heard the Beatles a few times, the knack that the Beatles would have of running out so the audience wouldn't follow them was doing God Save the Queen, and everyone stood rigid, and it wouldn't occur to you to run out and, the other thing is there seemed to be a lot of cartoons showing. Every big film had cartoons, and there were a lot of bad boys about. If you were a couple of girls going, there used to be creepy guys coming up and smack them in the face, But, I mean, that was quite, we had to really be warned and look out for them. And Parthenews was a big thing. And stage show and 6 acts, you haven't mentioned that? That was a lot of that.
Fantastic. Yeah, yeah, thank you. There's a lot going on in the memories, I'd say, and a number of the things that you mentioned, but actually not all of them have come up in my reading of these memories so far. So please complete a questionnaire. Tell us all about it. Sorry.
Just one other thing. I went to a girls' private boarding school, and it used to be the prize of they used to have weekly marks, and the top 3 every week in most private boarding schools used to be allowed to go to the cinema on Saturday. So it was considered a great prize as well.
That's absolutely fascinating stuff. Please tell us about it in a questionnaire so we can include it in the project. I genuinely love to hear more about that. I think this thing about the national anthem is particularly interesting because it seems to be... we have different memories of how the national anthem was being used, or being responded to, I should say, sorry, in cinemas. We have memories of people saying, exactly as you are, that no one moved, that it came on, people stood up and stood still. We also have memories of people, the second that the credits of a film came on, dashing desperately for the doors so that they didn't have to stand through the national anthem. A number of memories of that, particularly in Scotland, which is a political hot button to press, so let's dance over that now. But yes, we have memories of kind of different responses to that, and different responses in different kind of years of the 1960s. My general impression so far, which, as I say, I may not stick to as more data pours in, and as I get kind of chance to dig into that data more completely. But my general impression seems to be that there's a shift in attitude towards the national anthem in cinemas in the 60s, and that this kind of notion of the dash to the doors before it begins perhaps is a mid to late 60s thing. But I wouldn't want to kind of stake my career on that. So let me have a look at the data in more detail. But it's certainly something that we're interested in. And as I say, I would genuinely love to hear about your experiences. So please get involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was just wondering if you had any ideas about how cinema might contribute to gender as a cultural concept and how that might feed into audience reception and perceptions. You have Michael Caine, is that Judy Christie?
Judy Christie, yeah.
I was wondering how, in a kind of binary opposition way, we might view that as kind of how the audience might think, heroes, heroines, and how that might feed into audience reception.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that I'm particularly interested in. I've done some work on gender before. I've done some work on gendered audience responses to things before. And so for me, it's quite an interesting topic. So thank you for bringing that up. What we're finding, what I'm seeing so far in the data, and again, it's early days, but what I'm seeing in the data so far seems to be that stars are still a big thing in the 60s. People are still kind of going to films because of particular stars. And sexual attraction to the star seems to be still kind of playing a large part in which stars people like. And that's true of both genders. But the way that they talk about that sexual attraction to stars and the appeal of stars in a sexualized way seems to me to be rather similar, actually, across the genders. The way that it's talked about, I suppose, in the memory doesn't seem to be too different for men and women at this stage. But as I say, it's not something that I've paid specific attention to yet, but it will be there in the data as we go. So bear with us on that. I seem to be saying this a lot today, I apologise. But it's something that we are interested in. It's something that I'm trying to get on top of, and that's kind of my early reading of it. But again, it's very early days for that. But no, it is certainly something that we're looking at. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thanks. I wanted to say, I mean, this is, for someone else who's working on the 60s and 70s, this seems like particularly vital research. I was just interested in, I mean, I do oral history interviews as well, and I was interested in your approach to memory as a concept, and what you think these memories are telling us about. If it's more about memories of the 60s sort of refracted through our modern narrative of the 60s, or it tells us more about attitudes at the time.
No, this is certainly a study of people remembering the 60s in 2013, 2014, and 2015. And I think that's very clear in Melvin and my approach to this project, is that memory shifts. It's a construct. It's something that changes. And the ways in which we remember the 60s now are as much produced by what happened in the 60s as by the images of the 60s that have been produced since then. So, no, I mean, I'm always cautious around this. And that can be a problem for historians. I mean, if you're looking to corroborate this data to say, well, what is true and what is untrue in these memories, I think that way danger lies. For me, what's interesting is the fantasies of the 60s that are produced. And we have to acknowledge that memory is ultimately kind of a construct, as you say. And so within that, there are particular versions of the 60s being produced in memory. And their relationship to broader kind of cultural memories of the 60s is interesting. Their relationship to cinema in particular is interesting. I was watching Newslight last night, and they were talking about kind of Christmas adverts, and someone said, you know, cinema has a particularly powerful relationship to memory. There's nothing that does memory like cinema. And I very much agree with that. And cinema, so for me, is part of this constructing process. But you're absolutely spot on in that this isn't necessarily a reflection of reality. Or sorry, not necessarily an accurate depiction of reality. But for me, the fantasy is the interesting part. I mean, the ways in which we construct the 60s tell us so much about how we now respond to the 60s, how we now view the 60s, and how the 60s have been produced and reproduced and reproduced and reproduced since then. And so, we are interested in what we can corroborate. We are interested in what this tells us about the 60s and what actually happened. But we're also interested in this notion of construction, this notion of fantasy, this notion of the 60s as kind of a mythical period, as a period that happened but has since had kind of particular myths built around it. And so, yes, you're right to flag that up, and thank you for that. But it's something that we are interested in, certainly.
Just remains for me to, as someone born and bang in the middle of the mythical period,
complete our questionnaire.
bang on exactly in the middle. It's fascinating. So just leaves it for me just to ask you all to thank today's speaker in an appropriate way.